Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. You have joined community-based boards as a tool for greater equity. During this session, you will join the SEDEC Social Justice Fund as it shares its own journey in creating a community-based board. Learn why boards composed of grantee community members are important in enabling funders to be responsive and aligned with our values and mission. Community-based boards also serve as a critical tool for building equity, including racial justice, into your work. Hear about both the challenges and opportunities and leave with steps you can take to create such a model for your own board. I'm Jennifer Langton, Director of Organizational Grantmaking and Philanthropic Partnerships at the SEDEC Social Justice Fund. We are all very fortunate to be hearing next from Marcia Davis, Executive Director and Director of Organizational Strategy and Practice, Tomiko Ambrose Murray, board member and founder and lead consultant of Ambrose Consulting, Althea Gonzalez, board member and consultant at altheagonzalez.com. We are all based in Asheville, North Carolina. Don't forget to read the bios of these amazing colleagues who bring a wealth of experience to this conversation today. Next, let's turn to Marcia Davis, who will present why did the SEDEC Social Justice Fund pursue the idea of a community-based board of trustees, and share what was the process and steps by which SEDEC's community-based board took shape, from planning to the first board meeting. Take it away, Marcia.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for being here. I think it's impossible to really speak to what our process has been for building a community-based board without understanding the fuller equity journey that our organization has been through. The board piece, the community-based board, is one piece of a larger racial equity journey. So give me a moment to actually pull up our slides here. So the why of our community-based board is embedded in our racial equity journey. And the journey actually took us on this long road from going from the Amy Mandel Katina Rodas Fund. So some of you may know of us underneath that name and may know of our flagship program, the SEDEC Social Justice Fellowship. And the racial equity journey took us from going from the Amy Mandel Katina Rodas Fund, and now we're called the SEDEC Social Justice Fund. So if you're wondering if any of the names here seem familiar, that is why. And I want to speak a little bit to just the process that we went through. Our organization has been following, actually for the last 3 years, this framework for developing equity in our organization. And this framework was adapted by Ashley Cooper. She's a local consultant here in Asheville, and myself. And it's adapted from the Cycle of Liberation that was developed by Bobby Harrow and Developing a Liberatory Consciousness by Barbara Love. And that framework actually speaks to how do individuals go from, being steeped in the socialization of our society and some inequitable practices, and how do we go from inequity to equity? And what Ashley Cooper and I did is translated this individual journey to an organizational framework that can be used to help guide an organization from being aware that certain issues are occurring and actually making a plan for equity that's useful for their organization. And the board was actually a really fundamental piece of this framework. This is something our organization has been working through for about 3 years. And I'll take you through our steps of how we move through this framework. One of the things, though, I do want to point out, it's not important for you to know all the steps or pay attention to all the steps at this point in time, but I want to point out that the first step is awareness, the idea that you've woken up to the idea that there's some fundamental inequity in your organization. And we'll talk through like what SEDEC actually realized about themselves in the middle of that framework. But what most organizations do is they jump from awareness right to action, right? Like oh my gosh, you realize that there's an inequity. I imagine in the last couple of years, you're working in an organization and your fund has noticed that there might be some inequities. Our country is going through this moment of reckoning, people have been calling it, around racial equities. And there's usually this sense of urgency of like, oh no, we're doing something wrong. And you immediately want to jump into the pot. We found it incredibly useful to actually pause and go through the steps of this process, because some valuable pieces of information emerge when you stop, don't jump directly to action, but you actually know that there's an issue in your organization and you start with relationship and community building that allows you to pull in some more information from your community and local stakeholders to help you get a key understanding of what this inequity is. The important part to note about this cycle is that it's a cycle, right? It's cyclical. The idea that you can somehow emerge out of the cycle and not have to go through it again is a fallacy. And we realize as an organization, we call ourselves a learning organization, in part because we know that we're always going to be waking up to some issue or inequity in our organization, and that we'll have to kind of reemerge through this process again. And we feel that it's really important for our organization to be committed to constantly waking up, constantly addressing inequities as they occur, but also to have a really realistic idea of what it means to be developing equity in our organization. A lot of the issues that we're battling are from over 400 years of inequities in our country. And we're not going to solve those overnight, even with the best framework and the best plan. So we're prepared for the concept that we will need to continue iterating. And so continue to follow our journey as a fund, because I can imagine will probably be more shifts coming down the pike as we understand more and more about the inequities of race, inequities around gender, class, et cetera, that exist both in our fund, in philanthropy, and in our country at large. So we know for a fact that we'll be working on this for a pretty long time. But our conversation about the community-based boards actually emerged out of the awareness that our last class of fellows brought to us. Our ZEDX Social Justice Fellowship, if you know the history of our fund a little bit, was a grant-making program where we provided enough funds for the salary and the hiring of one social justice young emerging professional, and provided those positions to local nonprofits with the hope that these activists would then learn more about the nonprofit culture, learn more about the nonprofit world in Asheville, and then go out into the world and continue to improve our community. In about 2018, the last class of our fellowship was predominantly, in part because of a lot of the work we had been doing around diversifying who came to the table, the nonprofits that came to the table, and diversifying our applicants. We found that our last class was predominantly folks who identified as folks of color, and predominantly also queer as well. So we had a wonderful Black and Brown queer class, and they taught us so much about what was really happening for the social justice world, both in the South and nationally. And one of the things they really called us in on is the idea that at the time, the staff of our organization were all white women, right? And white women who have their own marginalized identities as well. Our funder and founder is Amy Mandel, who identifies as a Jewish lesbian. Most of our staff at the time identified as queer as well. And so there was this understanding of inequity, but around race, our fellows really said, are you walking your talk around race? Are you walking your talk around who gets to hold decision-making power in your organization? And one of the things that we had to answer really honestly was, actually, we're not sure. And I think that, one of the things I've been really proud of in our organization is the level of humility we've had around these conversations. I think a lot of organizations and funds, especially because you get so mired in the day-to-day of the work, when you get that type of feedback, hey, are you doing the work in a way that's equitable for all the people who are involved? There's kind of a moment where you want to just stop and maybe sweep that feedback under the rug, either because you're too busy or because it just feels like a little too overwhelming to address the concerns that are emerging. And one of the things that I find beautiful about the Amy Mandel Katina Rodas Fund at the time, is that they went on something called a pause for the cause. So our organizational grant making continued. However, the DEDIC Social Justice Fellowship paused so that we could do some reflecting on this program and thinking about how racial equity would be emerging in this process. So as part of this, in a process that actually was led by someone who's now on our community based board, Tamiko Ambrose here today with us, led by Tamiko Ambrose and Beth Trigg of Taproot Consulting. They led us on this process of starting to build relationship with key stakeholders in our community so that they could help us answer the question of what do we do now? Like, what do we do with the fact that we know that there are some really deep inequities steeped in the structure of our organization? And that we really had this dynamic of us as power holders have all the expertise and the knowledge, and then our grantees and fellows are just here to like suck it from us. We realized that we needed to do some kind of better understanding of what do local social justice leaders say about the work that we do? What do previous fellows say about the work that we do? How do we and what do local philanthropists also say about the work that we do? What insights do they have? Before we could ask those questions, though, we pulled together a group of trusted advisors who were community leaders in Asheville, North Carolina, who were leading work that we found inspiring and awesome and had voices that we felt could really help us think through what are the next steps in our journey. Althea and Tamiko, Tamiko, in addition to leading this group, Althea was one of our trusted advisors and stepped through this process with us. I'm placing this image here because I think sometimes when we think about relationship and community building, especially in a philanthropic sense, in our sector, sometimes that relationship building can look really straight-laced, kind of stodgy, very formal, in the sense that you are inviting folks into a room with a conference table with folks with suits, and then asking them in this incredibly regimented way, what are your opinions? What's your focus? And then some folks in our community have named social justice leaders that sometimes the relationship building between community leaders and funds is kind of extractive. And not as relational and authentic as they would like it to be. I think this picture really represents how we try to embed a sense of radical hospitality in all of the work that we did. So pulling these folks together into a comfortable space, actually having a meal as they were working through some of the bigger issues that we were dealing with as an organization, and getting the opportunity to laugh together to build a level of trust needed to really have our trusted advisors give us some honest feedback about who we were and how we were showing up in community. The relationship and community building phase takes time, but I will advise, we found as a team that it is so remarkably helpful that all of the folks that we have started to build these relationships and with throughout the process have ended up becoming really valuable advisors to our fund in the long term. So this is definitely a step that I think sometimes for the sake of urgency, we want to skip, but it's actually really crucial for all the work that happens afterwards. So what we did with our trusted advisors is we worked to kind of build some standard understanding, a shared analysis of racial equity and racial injustices. And we also did some internal work that was really guided both by Beth Trigg and Tamiko, but also by our staff internally as well. And we did some really deep diving into what is philanthropy? And we started identifying kind of the organizational systemic levers that supported the inequity that we were seeing in our organization. Seeing that the top of our organization was all white, while the bottom of our organization, well, the fellows that we were bringing in were mostly POC, or people of color. And one of the things that we realized, we started looking into the inequities that are embedded in philanthropy. We looked at the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that that's not always the most equitable way for us to take action against some of the inequities in our society. And one of the things that really became clear to us is due to power hoarding in the nonprofit community, that nonprofits are often led by white leaders, particularly white women, at least in Asheville, North Carolina. And while those who engage in the front line and grassroots work are mostly people of color, and that a lot of our work we were doing in community by making nonprofits, established nonprofits, our local partners, is an amazing partnership to have. And we needed to realize that embedded in those partnerships were going to be those racial inequities that you see throughout the nonprofit world, right? And so in part, our structure as a fund was really mimicking what we saw was happening for folks in our community around leadership and nonprofits in general. Asheville's nonprofit community looks a lot like the nonprofit community in a lot of different cities, in that the majority of the leadership of those communities, of those organizations, are white women. And we also had to do some really deep work and be vulnerable in terms of naming some of the ways in which we were hoarding power within the organization. Like a typical fund, our funder and founder at the time made all of the grant making decisions while our staff was really informing her and gathering data. But the final choice lay in the hands of our funder and founder, which just by definition is going to be a hoarding of power. We also did some external work by going through and getting a community research report. And these were 30-minute interviews with local social justice leaders and alumni from the fellowship. And we gathered all of that data. As part of the work that we did, the key text that really informed us and that we found super useful, and I'm naming here in the hopes that, if there's anything that you take from this work, if you were completely just starting your journey into thinking about some of these inequities and thinking about a community-based board, we found Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, to be an incredibly wonderful resource that we return to over and over again. Another resource was Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. Again, it doesn't speak specifically to philanthropy, but what it does speak to were some concepts that we found incredibly useful in terms of thinking, how do we want to shape our change as we go from racially inequitable organization to one that's more equitable. And so those texts I find useful and that we return to over and over again. So if you're just at the beginning of your journey, I'd recommend even just taking some time to maybe read this book on your own or reading it with your staff if you have any, and taking some time to reflect on how can your fund lean into some of the concepts that are present here. So here's what we did in terms of leaning into some of the things that came up in both our research, our understanding of the root causes of these inequities, and looking at these texts. The key insight that we realized that came back from all of this information was that equity requires sharing decision-making power with those who are most impacted by the problems we hope to solve. And if there's anything you take away from our work today, I think that's really the key piece. That our decision to pull together a community-based board is embedded in the idea that we really need to share decision-making power with those who are most impacted by the problems that we hope to solve. Right? As part of that restructuring, we are one of the things that I find amazing about our funds, but I also realize that not every fund is going to be in the same place, is we were open to not just redesigning the fellowship, but we completely redesigned our organization. So Rita redefined our mission and our vision with input from the community report. In fact, our mission now speaks to us redistributing wealth, power, and resources. And that was actually a phrase that came directly out of our community report. And so we're using the language of the folks that we're saying we're in community with, and we're starting to speak about these issues in the way that they say is most relevant to speak about those issues. What we also did is we completed a strategic plan that includes participatory grant making. So we've set aside $250,000 from our budget to be distributed as determined by 5 community leaders. And that's a new initiative, right? So going from our founder and funder, Amy Mandel, making all decisions, to sharing decision-making power with community leaders. So that's in addition to what we realized, that's in addition to forming these community-based boards. And here, finally I can just do the straight answer of why did we establish the community-based boards? They are for us a key form of accountability, right? So that what's holding us accountable is not just our funder founder, not their family's desires, but also that community leaders who are working in the social justice realm are actually holding us accountable to making the change in community that we say we want to make. And we realized that the best way for them to hold us accountable was for this board to become an advisory body, but that provides advice to us on the strategic plan. They let us know, is there any possible harm in our strategic plan to our community? Are there ways in which we, hope that something would be amazingly received, but perhaps it's not where the community, our communities are really moving in terms of their social justice movement work? And how do we make sure that our strategy as a fund is aligned with the work that's happening in our community? And the key way that they hold us accountable is, like most board of trustees, they have evaluation power over my role, the executive director role, right? So whether or not I continue or a new leader needs to be brought to the team is really the decision of our board of directors, our board of trustees rather, and our board chair in particular. And we did some recruitment, and I'll talk about that in a minute about what those steps look like. But our board of trustees ended up being 8 local community leaders, 7 of whom are women of color. And our funder and founder stepped away from the board of trustees. And part of the reason she pulled away, and that was not an original part of our structured plan for this board, but it actually emerged out of the analysis building work we had been doing together, is she realized that as a person with wealth, regardless of how we structured the board, her presence on the board would shift the way our these community leaders felt safe engaging in the space. That regardless of how much radical hospitality we may offer, that having the funder in the space would make all of these people attuned to her and her desires, as opposed to attuning what might be right for the community. So what felt right for her and what felt right for our organization was to build this board of trustees without our funder and founder involved. So we've gone through a complete transition of our funder and founder holding all the power to actually grant-making, decision-making power being distributed among the staff and community leaders through a participatory grant-making process, and then power over the overall strategy moving from our funder and founder to myself as a staff member and our board of trustees. And here's what we gain. I think a lot of folks, when you hear the idea of a funder and founder pulling away from control, or you hear a family pulling away from control, there ends up being this fear of, oh my gosh, what are we going to lose by sharing power? And I think it's really important in this current moment for us to really think about what we've gained as a fund by sharing power. We've gained innovative solutions to complex problems. If there's anyone who's going to tell you how best to use money in regards to solving some of the inequities we're dealing with on a regular basis, it will be community leaders and social justice leaders. Even in our, looking at specific questions that we thought were simple, like how can Zedek work together with Asheville to disrupt oppressive structures and inequitable systems? What you see here in terms of the red marks in this image were all the ways in which the community leaders we invited to the table edited, even we're asking questions about how are you even speaking about these issues that we're talking about? When we said Zedek works together with Asheville, who's Asheville? Which communities are you referring to? And we say disrupt, we said as a team and originally that we wanted to disrupt this oppressive structures. And they're like, no, that's not the language we use anymore. We talk about dismantling them. And they explained to us why that was really useful. The other thing we gained was an asset-based view of the communities that we work in relationship with. So instead of seeing our communities as being deficient, having problems that we need to constantly fix and face, that we were coming in as a savior, as a funder to help our communities get to the places that they need to get to, we realize now that there is a brilliant, deep level wealth of expertise in our communities, that for us, wealth no longer equals expertise, because we realize that the expertise in the work that we're doing lies in the hands of these community leaders. And we also began to see the ways in which communities are working for themselves to get the answers that work well for them. And for the sake of time, I'll just skip through to one thing that was also really important, was just shared emotional labor. It's actually wonderful sharing grant making decision power with community leaders, because now all the weight of holding, are we making the right decision, isn't just falling on us. Now we actually have a team full of people who can hold that with us, which, I think as lean funders, we don't really talk as much enough about the emotional weight of having to make these grant making decisions, and the emotional weight of having to decide who gets money and who doesn't. And one of the unexpected results of having all of these folks at the table was for us that we had other people to hold that with us, and other people who had expertise and trust built into the community. So I'm going to take you really quickly through the process and steps that we took. And here are the process steps that we found really critical in our process. One, we defined what power the board would hold. We created a board member position description. It was important for us to remove any fundraising requirement for that board member position, because if we're inviting in community leaders, they may or may not have access to wealth and funds, and we didn't want that to be a barrier to their participation. We compensate board members for their time, just like larger funds would do, but also because we were acknowledging that their experts were bringing in a level of expertise that we don't have at the table. And as part of that, we maintained a tone that honors their expertise, right? So they're not coming in for us. This is not just extractive. The idea is that they're coming in as consultants to your space. I would recommend recruiting board members who represent unheard voices and perspectives in your organization, and who are doing the type of work that you'd like to fund. It's important to also craft a conflict of interest policy. One of the things that we found is that when you start recruiting from the community, a lot of them are coming from organizations who might be potential grantees, might be potential grantee partners in the future. So it's important to craft a policy that makes it really clear what how are board members allowed in that decision-making process or not allowed in that process. And also making it clear that participation, at least for what it meant for us, participation, there you go, in the board actually meant that that they were not eligible really for funds to go to the organizations that they represented, and they definitely could not be part of that decision-making process or be paid from the funds that were being sent to that organization. The decision we also made was, do you invite people to be on the board, or do you get people to apply? Our first round is an invitation. So we invited folks that we already had good relationships with to help us launch this structure. But in future terms of the board, our goal is to have an application process to have more equitable outreach in that way. And I think, again, a really important piece for our first board meeting was to engage in radical hospitality. All of our board members got care packages with a copy of Emergent Strategy that we had been reading, a candle to light at our first meeting because it had to be virtual. So they all got a delivery of a candle that they could bring to that Zoom meeting. And that radical hospitality does a really, is a really important part of building some of the trust that you need for folks to come together into that space. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to read through these slides, but if for those who are watching the recording or watching it live, I think it's important, the slides will be some of the content that you'll get a chance to download. And it's important to ask some real questions of your organization before you invite community members onto the board, because you want to make sure that you're clear on what decision-making power they will have, and essentially not wasting people's time. I think one of the key questions to ask yourself is, what aspects of a board structure are legally required? And where do we have the space to build something transformational? Very often, a lot of the things that we think are legally required for a board are actually just preferences or traditions. And there's actually more space in board structure development than we think we can actually have. A few more questions to ask your funder and founder. And I think these questions are essential because your funder or founder is going to have there are some feelings, and there's a very real emotional process that seeding power requires. And when you ignore that process, part of what you may find is you may have developed a whole board, but then there are certain fears that emerge that then yank back the power from this structure that you've created. So some of the questions you may want to ask your funder and founder are, what do you want your legacy to be? What is your relationship with risk? And where would you like to retain veto power? Just highlighting those questions. And again, the fuller list will be available on the list of slides as well. But one of the processes we underwent through shifting this equity journey, shifting the structure of our organization, is I had a co-director at the time, and she sat with our funder and founder and really worked through, what are the values that you want to ensure stay a part of the organization? Where are the ways that you want to retain veto power? And also, more importantly, what do you lose by continuing to hoard decision-making power? So with this, I'll let us move on to the rest of, really, I think the most important part, which is speaking to our board members and getting a sense from them of what their experience has been like.
Thank you, Marcia. That was an incredible summary. Whew. I'd first like to ask Althea Gonzalez, who we're very lucky to have two of our board members here, Althea and Tomiko Ambrose Murray. But Althea, the first question, what is it like for a community member to serve on a funder board like the SEDC board?
I appreciate that you framed it as a funder board like SEDC's board, because I'm curious what other funder boards might be like. This funder board I have felt not only valued as a person and reinforced in my value that I bring to the organization, but also treated very much like a human being. There's a lot of relationship building that happens in board meetings and outside of board meetings. So there's a connection that is being built here. And so while I've served on a lot of boards before, including the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, big kinds of boards, this board has a different level of relationship, both with staff and with other board members. So I feel very able to bring my whole self, I guess, not just my expertise as a consultant in the philanthropic field, but my whole self to the conversation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And Tomiko, what is it like for you to serve on a funder board like SEDC?
Thank you, Jennifer. So for me, it's such an exciting opportunity because I feel that I really have an opportunity to truly impact my community and to a space to contribute my expertise in my community and my experience, and that it's valued. And Althea was also saying that we feel valued as board members and appreciated, and there's been like tangible, not just gifts, but I think just really, I feel like SEDC as an organization is a collaborator, and I feel like that they would support me in anything that I'm trying to do. So I just feel like it is a reciprocal relationship. And that includes the other amazing community leaders that are also on the board. And I think that, yeah, just so often folks who are most impacted by the isms and the structural repression, so often we're left out of decision-making tables. And so it's really an opportunity to, yeah, to bring our voices to the direction of SEDC. And yeah, so I feel really honored to participate, and it's actually a joy. It was a joy to be invited to participate, so.
And Tomiko, well, thank you for sharing that, and I'll bounce it right back to you with the second question. Why, for our audience, are such models important for funders to incorporate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think having a board that's representative of the communities that an organization works in service to, it's really important because so often the people who are making decisions about investment and how to invest. They're often made by folks who are furthest from the issues. And so this means people who are furthest from the harms that come with structural oppression, including structural racism. And so a model that actually invites people to not only just sit at the table, but also to help build the table, that they actually are able to bring all these multiple perspectives and just different ways of looking at things. And Marsha was describing some of the really great questions that were posed just in the way things are framed, the language that's used, the ways the questions are asked. So when folks who are impacted are actually able to contribute to that conversation, I think that there is ultimately deeper impact can be had. And so I think, yeah, people who are part of communities being at the table actually can speak to the realities of, you know, all the nuances of the work that's happening at the, you know, in nonprofit organizations at the grassroots level. So also lastly, equity, it actually means a shift in power. And so I think that Tzedek has really done a great job in, yeah, and as I said earlier, allowing community to be part of building the table and recognizing that we are experts of our experience.
And you've certainly helped in shepherding us along in that journey. You and your colleague, Beth Trigg, for which we are grateful. And how about you, Althea? Why are such models important for funders?
Well, I've worked in philanthropy across the country, and I've seen when funders actually create a participatory board and a participatory grant-making process, a few things happen. One is funders step off kind of the pedestal where they have the answers and they know what the community needs, and develop it's not only a shift in power, but a shift in perspective that we're a learning organization. We're learning with community. We don't have all the answers. There's a humility that is created in foundations when they take that perspective, and that changes changes how they perceive the problems that are happening in the community. They become very much more collaborative and cooperative with other members to, you know, have the multiple perspectives of the elephant, you know, that old metaphor. Then they recognize they only have one piece and they need all the pieces to move forward. And so it totally shifts the organizational culture of foundations to have that participatory board and grant making with community members. And also for foundations who are always saying, we need to build capacity in our grassroots and people of color-led organizations. There's nothing more powerful to shift the capacity of those organizations than when community members get to be part of allocating dollars and making decisions about how philanthropy happens in their communities. They have a new perspective that then they become not only community leaders, you know, in kind of a grassroots way, but they become community leaders in the philanthropic sector as well. And we so need that in philanthropy to shift from the white, you know, power that we have in philanthropy, old money, to community-led philanthropy. So it really shifts to both the internal part of that philanthropic organization, but also the community perspective about philanthropy. I've seen it happen where one foundation starts to do that, and then a collaborative of foundations come together on a particular project, and they have a community-led grant-making portfolio. All of a sudden, it changes the whole dynamic of how that city even functions in the philanthropic sector. And I love that Marsha said that Tzedek sees itself as a learning organization, because I think that's absolutely essential for emergent strategy to be effective, is to consider ourselves learners rather than people who know the answers. And so having community members there, they are learning too. They're understanding philanthropy in a different way. They're bringing their expertise and sharing that. we're all learners or masters in training rather than, the people who know the answers. And I think that's powerful.
It's very humbling and it's freeing for everyone, right? Yeah, just
Absolutely.
in different ways, but freeing for everyone.
It's that shared emotional labor that Marcia was talking about. As a community, it's shared emotional labor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I have a final question, and we can go into other questions too for each other as well if we have time. But so Althea, what have you learned so far about being a board member of SEDC? Is there anything you would like to share with the audience?
I'd say two things. One, it's always about relationships. And if in Marcia's cycle of equity building, that part about building relationships and the outreach and to community members is essential. That whatever is done, the amount of time that we spend on relationship building as a board at SEDC absolutely makes it possible for us to do good progress and good work going forward. So that's part one, relationship building. And the second thing is that I feel that my role as a board member of SEDC is to support the staff, and particularly Marcia as a woman of color in philanthropy, which is a rarity, to support her and the rest of the staff in being bold and challenging the inequities that we have within philanthropy. And so I feel honored and grateful to be at a foundation where I can support that change that I want to see in the larger philanthropic sector.
Thank you. And how about you, Tomiko? Anything you'd like to share for our audience?
Yeah, Althea, you named exactly what I was going to share in a couple places. And one being that something I was not necessarily approaching this new board member role as part of my work is to get to support the staff at SEDC in fulfilling their roles. And also, I think that one thing about the culture is that, and I think this includes the staff, is that there is an effort to really take care of each other, take care of ourselves, take care of each other, and leave space for people to bring their full humanity. Because often when we're like, chop, 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 outcomes, 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 and we don't have space to actually build community, build relationships, authentic relationships. And as Althea said, also that that relationship piece, I also have worked with folks all over the country, and I have not seen yet any shortcuts to relationship building, because the reality is that harm will happen, conflict will happen. It's important that people are able to engage in healthy conflict and be able to, have an accountability culture. And in order to do that, it's really important to have strong relationships that can carry the struggle. And equity work is hard work. It is not easy work. And the labor that SEDC has taken on as an organization has really, I think, reaffirmed the importance of having a culture of belonging. Dr. John Powell calls it a culture of belonging, and one where people can bring themselves and we can get our hands dirty together and learn from each other. And last thing I want to say is, philanthropy as an institution is really kind of informed by this this white savior complex, like rescue, the folks who are struggling. And I think that this work of actually inviting folks in and sharing power is also healing. It's healing. It's like a organizational atonement. Yeah, and I think that that's something that I've been thinking more and more about, and that is present in the SEDC space, is that this work is meant to be healing, because we're trying to heal our communities from oppression. And so more to come. I know, we're just getting started, so I know we'll have more to share in the future, but that's what I have for now.
Thank you to our two Board of Trustees, Althea Gonzalez and Tamiko Ambrose Murray. Really appreciate you being here today. It's been so helpful to hear from you and to hear about your experiences, and great appreciation for our Executive Director, Marcia Davis of the SEDEC Social Justice Fund. Please join us later at the end of today. You can chat with Marcia and I, and we'll post some reflection questions for you, and we'll put some in the chat as well during this live session. So thank you so much.